November 18th, 1952. Chicago's South Side, Blue Note Club backstage corridor. Louis Armstrong stood with a glass of water in his hand when a sound stopped him cold. He had been on stages for 30 years, walked through thousands of standing ovations, but the sound he heard right now was different. A woman's muffled sob, then a man's angry voice. Louis slowly placed the glass on the table. His hands were trembling. These hands had created melodies that shook the world, but now they just trembled. Because that sound took Louis back years. New Orleans, the nights his mother, Mayanne, cried, employers, degrading words. Those scenes Louis had watched, unable to do anything. But tonight was different. Tonight Louis wasn't just a child. Tonight he had power, and tonight he was going to use it. Nobody saw what happened backstage. But 10 minutes later, when Louis walked onto that stage, 12,000 people saw the expression on his face, and they knew that tonight history would be written. What Louis whispered into that club owner's ear would echo through Chicago for decades. But before we get there, you need to understand something. This wasn't just about one night. This was about 51 years of pain, humiliation, and a promise Louis made to himself when he was just 7 years old. But the story begins earlier. 3 weeks before that November night, Louis Armstrong walked into the Blue Note Club for the first time. He was there to check the acoustics, meet the staff, prepare for what would become his biggest Chicago residency. The club owner, Bernard Hoffman, greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Louis had seen that smile before. It was the smile white businessmen wore when they needed something from you but didn't respect you. Bernard wanted Louis Armstrong, the star, the moneymaker, the crowd puller, but he didn't want Louis Armstrong, the man. Louis could feel it in the way Bernard avoided direct eye contact, the way he positioned himself slightly above Louis when they talked, the way his handshake was just a fraction too loose. Professional courtesy without genuine warmth. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. If you're moved by this story of courage and dignity, please consider subscribing to our channel. We bring you the untold moments that shaped music history, the human stories behind the legends. That first day at the club, Louis met Maria. She was carrying a tray of glasses, moving quietly through the empty venue, cleaning tables that would soon be filled with Chicago's jazz enthusiasts. She was maybe 40 years old, with tired eyes and calloused hands. When she saw Louis, she smiled. A real smile, not Bernard's calculated grin, but genuine warmth. She said, "Mr. Armstrong, it's an honor to have you here." Louis noticed something in her voice. Respect, yes, but also something else. Recognition. Not recognition of fame, but recognition of shared experience. Maria was a black woman working in a club owned by a white man in 1952 Chicago. Louis was a black musician performing in that same club. They existed in the same system, just on different stages. Louis said, "Please call me Louis, and your name?" She seemed surprised that he asked. "Maria, sir. Maria Thompson." They talked for 20 minutes that day. Louis learned that Maria had 2 children, that her husband had died in a factory accident 2 years earlier, that she worked 2 jobs to keep her family fed. Louis told her about his mother, Mayanne, who had worked as a maid in New Orleans, who had scrubbed floors and washed clothes for white families while raising Louis alone. When Louis left the club that day, he thought about his mother. Mayanne had died in 1927, 25 years ago, but Louis still carried her struggles with him every single day. Here's something most people don't know about Louis Armstrong. Behind the famous smile, behind the trumpet virtuosity, behind the showmanship, there was a man who never forgot where he came from. Louis was born on August 4th, 1901, in the poorest section of New Orleans, a neighborhood so dangerous it was called the battlefield. His father abandoned the family when Louis was an infant. His mother worked brutal hours for almost nothing. Louis grew up watching his mother be treated like she was invisible. White employers would bark orders at her, never say please or thank you, pay her less than promised, blame her for things she didn't do, and Mayanne would take it because she had no choice, because she had a son to feed, because in 1907 New Orleans a black domestic worker had no power, no voice, no options. Young Louis would see his mother come home exhausted, see her count pennies to buy food, see her cry when the money wasn't enough, and he would ask her, Mama, why do they treat you like that? Mayanne would say, Baby, that's just how the world is, but it won't always be this way. You're going to be something special. You're going to have a voice. That promise drove Louis his entire life. When he picked up his first cornet at the Colored Waifs Home for Boys, when he taught himself to read music by candlelight, when he left New Orleans for Chicago in 1922 with just a suitcase and a dream, he was carrying his mother's words with him. You're going to have a voice. Over the next 3 weeks, Louis returned to the Blue Note Club for rehearsals. Each time he saw Maria, she would bring him water, make sure his dressing room was comfortable, ask if he needed anything. They developed an easy friendship. Louis would tell her stories about New Orleans, about the riverboats where he first performed, about meeting King Oliver. Maria would tell him about her children. Her son wanted to be a doctor. Her daughter loved to sing. Maria said, Sometimes I play your records for her. She knows every word to What a Wonderful World. Louis smiled. Bring her to a show. I'll get you tickets. Maria's face lit up. Really? Mr. Louis, she would be so happy. But then her expression changed. She looked nervous. But Mr. Hoffman, he doesn't like us bringing family. He says we're here to work, not socialize. Louis felt something tighten in his chest. What do you mean? Maria hesitated, then quietly, He's very strict with the cleaning staff. Says we should stay in the background, stay invisible. He doesn't want customers seeing too many of us walking around. Louis didn't say anything. But he remembered something. In 1931, Louis had performed at a club in Memphis. The owner had told the black musicians to enter through the back door, to stay in a separate dressing room, to not mingle with white performers. Louis had been furious but powerless. He needed the money. He had taken the disrespect because he had no choice. But that was 21 years ago. Things had changed. Louis had changed. Now he had power. Now he had a voice. And now, hearing about Bernard's treatment of Maria and the other staff, Louis felt that old anger rising again. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a position where you saw injustice but stayed silent because speaking up felt too risky? Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. The third week, Louis noticed something disturbing. Bernard spoke to Maria and the other black staff members with barely concealed contempt. He would snap his fingers at them instead of calling their names. He would criticize their work loudly in front of customers. He would deduct pay for minor infractions. Louis watched Bernard yell at Maria one afternoon because she had placed a water pitcher on the wrong table. "Can't you follow simple instructions?" Bernard's voice was sharp, cutting. Maria apologized quietly, her head down. Louis saw her hands shaking. After Bernard walked away, Louis approached Maria. "You okay?" Maria forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mr. Louis, just clumsy today." But Louis could see she wasn't fine. He could see the humiliation in her eyes. He had seen that same look in his mother's eyes 50 years ago. Louis said, "Maria, you don't deserve to be treated like that." Maria's smile faded. She looked around nervously, making sure Bernard wasn't nearby. Then she said very quietly, "Mr. Louis, I need this job. I have 2 kids depending on me. If I lose this job, I don't know how I'll feed them, so I take it. I take whatever Mr. Hoffman dishes out, because I have to." Louis understood. That was the trap. The system was designed to keep people powerless. You need the job, so you tolerate the abuse. And the abuser knows you need the job, so they keep abusing. Louis had escaped that trap through music, through talent that made him too valuable to mistreat openly. But Maria didn't have that escape. She was trapped. Louis went back to his hotel that night and couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Maria, about his mother, about all the people who worked invisible jobs, who endured daily humiliation, who had no voice. Louis Armstrong was one of the most famous musicians in the world. He had played for kings and presidents. He had broken racial barriers. But what did it all mean if he couldn't use his voice to help people like Maria? His mother had told him he would have a voice, but a voice meant nothing if you stayed silent. November 18th arrived, opening night. The Blue Note Club was packed. 12,000 people filled every seat, every corner, every inch of standing room. This was the concert Chicago had been waiting for. Louis Armstrong live, performing his greatest hits, bringing his magic to the South Side. Backstage, Louis prepared. He went through his usual routine, warming up his embouchure, running scales on his trumpet, focusing his mind. The band was ready. The stage was set. Everything was perfect. Then Louis walked to the small kitchenette backstage to get a glass of water. That's when he heard it, the sound that changed everything. A woman crying. Not loud, theatrical crying. Quiet, broken, hopeless crying. The kind of crying that comes from a place of deep pain. Louis turned toward the sound. At the end of the backstage corridor, near the kitchen entrance, Maria stood with her back against the wall. Her white uniform was wrinkled. Her hands covered her face. Her shoulders shook. And standing in front of her, pointing his finger in her face, was Bernard Hoffman. Louis moved closer, stayed out of sight, listened. Bernard's voice was low but venomous. You think you're special because Louis Armstrong talks to you? You're not special, you're a maid. That's all you'll ever be. And if you keep slacking off, I'll replace you in a heartbeat. There are 100 women who would love your job. Maria's voice was barely audible. I wasn't slacking, Mr. Hoffman. I was just... Bernard cut her off. I don't care what you were doing. When I give you an instruction, you follow it. You don't think. You don't question. You obey. That's what I pay you for. Do you understand? Maria didn't respond immediately. Bernard stepped closer. I said, do you understand? Maria's voice broke. Yes, sir. Bernard turned to walk away, then paused. And don't go crying to Louis Armstrong. He's here to perform, not to babysit the help. Then he was gone. Louis stood in the shadows, his hands clenched into fists. Every word Bernard said echoed words Louis had heard in his childhood. Words thrown at his mother. Words that treated human beings like property. Louis looked at Maria. She was still against the wall, still crying, trying to compose herself. Louis could walk away. He could pretend he hadn't heard. He could do his show, collect his money, move on. That would be the safe choice, the smart choice. But Louis thought about his mother. He thought about Mayanne scrubbing floors, taking abuse, suffering in silence. He thought about the promise he made to himself 45 years ago. If I ever have power, I'll use it. If I ever have a voice, I'll speak. Louis walked onto the stage. 12,000 people erupted in applause. The band started the opening riff of When the Saints Go Marching In. Louis raised his trumpet, but he didn't play. He lowered the trumpet. The band, confused, stopped playing. The applause died down. Louis walked to the microphone. The room was completely silent now. 12,000 people waited. Louis said, Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, but there's not going to be a show tonight. The crowd gasped. Confused murmurs rippled through the audience. Louis continued, I've been a musician for 30 years. I've played in the best venues in the world. And I've also played in places where I was treated like I didn't matter, where I had to enter through the back door, where I was reminded every single day that my skin color made me less than human. I took it because I had to, because I needed to survive. But tonight I can't take it anymore. The audience was stunned. This wasn't what they came for. They came for music, for entertainment, for escape. But Louis wasn't giving them escape. He was giving them truth. Louis said, Tonight, I met a woman who works here. Her name is Maria Thompson. She's a single mother with 2 kids. She works 2 jobs. She's one of the hardest working people I've ever met. And tonight, before this show, I heard her employer talk to her like she was garbage. I heard him threaten her. I heard him break her spirit. Bernard Hoffman was standing at the side of the stage, his face red with rage. He started moving toward Louis, but Louis raised his hand. Stay where you are, Bernard. Everyone needs to hear this. Bernard froze. Louis turned back to the audience. This isn't just about Maria. This is about every person who works an invisible job. Every person who gets treated like they don't matter. Every person who suffers in silence because they need the paycheck. My mother was one of those people. She worked herself to death so I could have a chance, and I promised her that if I ever had a voice, I would use it. Louis gestured toward the backstage area. Maria, can you come out here? There was a long silence, then slowly Maria emerged from the shadows. Her face was tear-stained. She looked terrified. Louis walked over to her, took her hand, led her to center stage. "This is Maria Thompson. She deserves your respect. She deserves dignity. She deserves to be treated like a human being." The audience didn't know how to react. Some applauded. Others sat in uncomfortable silence. Louis turned to Bernard Hoffman, who was still standing at the edge of the stage, looking like he wanted to disappear. Louis said, "Bernard, come here." Bernard hesitated. Louis said it again, firmer. "Come here." Bernard walked onto the stage. Louis looked at him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Louis leaned in close, so close that only Bernard could hear what came next. What Louis whispered into Bernard Hoffman's ear that night became the subject of speculation for years. The only people who knew were Louis and Bernard, and Louis never publicly revealed what he said, but witnesses described Bernard's reaction. His face went white. His hands started shaking. He looked at Louis with an expression that mixed fear, shame, and something else. Recognition. Whatever Louis said, it cut deep. It hit Bernard in a place he didn't know he had. After Louis finished whispering, he stepped back. He looked at Maria. He looked at the audience. Then he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to refund every ticket sold for tonight. The Blue Note Club will reimburse you, because I won't perform in a place that treats its workers like they're less than human. Thank you for coming. And I'm sorry." Louis put down his trumpet. He took Maria's hand. And together they walked off the stage. The audience sat in stunned silence. Then slowly one person started clapping. Then another. Then 10. Then 100. Within seconds, 12,000 people were on their feet, giving Louis Armstrong a standing ovation. Not for music, for courage, for using his voice, for doing what so many people wished they could do, but were too afraid to try. Bernard Hoffman stood alone on the stage, watching his biggest event collapse around him. The look on his face said everything. He had lost. Here's what happened next. Within 24 hours, the story spread through Chicago like wildfire. Newspapers picked it up. Radio stations discussed it. Some praised Louis. Others criticized him for canceling the show, but everyone was talking about it. Bernard Hoffman's reputation took a massive hit. Musicians started refusing to play at the Blue Note Club. Customers stopped coming. The Chicago Musicians Union opened an investigation into working conditions at the venue. Within 6 months, Bernard sold the club and left Chicago. The new owners, a black-owned cooperative, made sure all staff members were treated fairly and paid living wages. They named the main performance hall the Mae Armstrong Room in honor of Louis's mother and Maria. 3 days after the canceled concert, Louis Armstrong personally paid for Maria's children's education all the way through college. Maria's daughter eventually became a music teacher. Her son became a civil rights lawyer. When Maria was interviewed by the Chicago Defender newspaper in 1968, 16 years after that night, she said, "Mr. Louis didn't just save my job, he saved my dignity. He showed me that I mattered, that I wasn't invisible, and he taught my children that standing up for what's right is more important than playing it safe." Louis Armstrong never returned to the Blue Note Club, but he didn't need to. The message had been sent, and people heard it. In 1953, Louis began using his platform to speak out against racial injustice more openly. In 1957, after the Little Rock school integration crisis, Louis publicly condemned President Eisenhower's inaction, calling the government two-faced for promoting democracy abroad while allowing racism at home. It was a controversial statement that cost Louis some fans and some gigs, but Louis didn't care. He had found his voice, and he wasn't going to be silent anymore. Before we close this story, I want to ask you something. Louis Armstrong used his platform, his fame, his voice to stand up for someone who had no voice. What would you have done in his position? Would you have played the show and stayed silent, or would you have risked everything to do what was right? Leave your answer in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts on this. Now, the question everyone wanted to know: what did Louis actually whisper to Bernard Hoffman? For decades, it remained a mystery. But in 1984, 13 years after Louis's death, a journalist named Marcus Webb interviewed Bernard Hoffman, who was then 78 years old and living in Florida. The interview was published in Downbeat magazine. Bernard, near the end of his life, finally revealed what Louis said to him that night. Louis had leaned in close and whispered, My mother worked for men like you. She cleaned their houses, raised their children, cooked their food, and they treated her like dirt. She died tired and broken, thinking she didn't matter. But she mattered. Maria matters. Every person you've humiliated matters. And here's what you need to understand. Right now, 12,000 people are watching us. If you ever treat Maria or any of your staff like that again, I will make sure everyone in Chicago knows exactly what kind of man you are. Your club will be empty. Your reputation will be destroyed, and you'll spend the rest of your life knowing that Louis Armstrong, the man you hired to make you money, is the reason you lost everything. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to apologize to Maria. You're going to give her a raise, and you're going to treat every person who works for you with dignity. Because if you don't, I will come back. And next time, I won't be this kind. When Marcus Webb asked Bernard how he felt hearing those words, Bernard said, I felt like I'd been hit by a train. Nobody had ever called me out like that. Nobody had ever made me face what I was doing. Louis Armstrong could have just walked away. He could have let me keep treating people badly, but he didn't. He held up a mirror and made me look at myself, and I didn't like what I saw. Bernard paused, then added, I did what Louis told me to do. I apologized to Maria. I gave her a raise, and I tried to be better, but the damage was done. I'd spent so many years treating people like they didn't matter that when it came time to face the consequences, everything fell apart. Louis Armstrong didn't destroy me. I destroyed myself. Louis just refused to be complicit in it. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971, at his home in Corona, Queens. He was 69 years old. His funeral was attended by thousands, but one person who came wasn't famous, wasn't in the music industry, wasn't a celebrity. It was Maria Thompson. She stood in the crowd, holding the hands of her 2 adult children, and cried. When a reporter asked her why she came, Maria said, Louis Armstrong saved my life. I needed to say goodbye. Maria lived until 2003. She was 91 years old when she died. In her obituary, her family mentioned that she always kept a photograph of Louis Armstrong on her wall. Under the photograph, she had written in careful handwriting, "The man who gave me my voice." If this story moved you, if it made you think about courage and standing up for what's right, please consider subscribing to our channel. We tell these stories because they matter, because Louis Armstrong's legacy isn't just music, it's humanity. November 18th, 1952. A concert that never happened, a show that was canceled. But a moment that changed lives. Louis Armstrong didn't play a single note that night, but he created something more powerful than any melody. He created dignity. He created hope. He created proof that one voice, used courageously, can echo through generations. His mother, May Ann, had told him he would have a voice. That night in Chicago, Louis proved she was right. And somewhere, in whatever place May Ann's spirit rested, she was smiling. Because her son had done what she always knew he would do. He had mattered, and he had made sure others knew they mattered too. That's the real story of Louis Armstrong, not just the musician, the man, the voice, the hero who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop the music and speak the truth.